You've probably spent a significant amount of time worrying about your own flaws. Maybe it's a crooked tooth or a patch of bad skin, or the fact that your posture makes you look like a question mark in every candid photo. We spend a small fortune on gym memberships and skincare routines just to look normal. But imagine for a second that your face wasn't just your face. It was a national asset. Imagine that a single blemish on your nose wasn't just a bad day, but a sign that God was officially over you and your entire family tree. Welcome to the world of British royals, where looking divine was a full-time job with a very high mortality rate. In the hallowed halls of the vault, we don't look at the velvet robes. We look at what they were trying to hide underneath them. For centuries, the crown wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a very expensive mask, designed to cover up the fact that the people wearing it were falling apart at the seams. If history is a crime scene, then the royal portraits you see in the museums are the ultimate tampered evidence. Those painters were basically the original filters, working overtime to smooth out the reality of lives lived in drafty places filled with lead and bad luck. We'd like to think of these as statues of perfection, but if you actually stood next to them, you'd probably want to hold your breath and back away slowly. Take Elizabeth I, for example. In her portrait, she's a pale, ethereal version of eternal youth. She looks like a porcelain doll that's never seen a day of sunlight in a single worry. But the reality was a bit more crunchy. After a bout with a nasty fever in her late 20s, her skin was left looking like the surface of the moon. This was a problem. In the 16th century, if you didn't look like a glowing angel, people started wondering if you were actually fit to hold the keys to the kingdom. Her solution wasn't a better diet or a spa day. No. Elizabeth went for the nuclear option. Venetian ceruse. It was a thick paste made of white lead and vinegar. She smeared it on so thick that her face became a literal mask. It was the ultimate administrative era of beauty. As the lead started eating her skin, she just added more lead to cover the damage. By the end of her life, she had about an inch of toxic sludge on her face, and her hair had mostly checked out, replaced by a rotation of 80 different wigs. She didn't look like a queen, she looked like a crumbling statue that had been poorly repaired with wet chalk. But it wasn't just the skin, it was the structural integrity of the royals themselves. We've all been told the story of Richard III. Shakespeare painted him as a bottled spider, a man so twisted and bent that his very presence was an insult to the floorboards he walked on. For centuries, people thought this was just Tudor propaganda, the ultimate smear campaign by the people who took his crown. They wanted him to look like a villain, so they gave him the body of one. But wait, the twist isn't that the propaganda was a lie. The twist is that the truth was actually worse for his physical comfort than the fiction ever suggested. When they found Richard under a parking lot in 2012, the forensic soot revealed that his spine didn't just have a hunch. It was a literal corkscrew of severe scoliosis. His right shoulder was significantly higher than his left, and his torso was compressed into a shape that would make every breath a deliberate negotiation. Richard wasn't the monster history painted him as, but he was a man living with a state of constant, agonizing structural engineering. He didn't lean into the villain look. He hired a genius tailor to create a suit of fabric armor. By using clever padding and specifically cut doublés, he managed to trick the entire world into thinking he was as straight as an arrow. He spent his life hiding a physical disfigurement so successfully that it took 500 years and a shovel to find the truth. He wasn't a hunchback monster. He was the original master of the angled selfie. As we move into the Stuart era, though, we find the Merry Monarch, Charles II. He was usually remembered for his wigs and his spaniels, but skeptical sophisticates see a man whose later years were a masterclass in hidden agony. Charles suffered from a gout so aggressive it turned his joints into pockets of chalk. To the public, he was the height of Restoration cool. Behind closed doors, his legs were wrapped in hot, vinegar-soaked flannels, and he was being purged by doctors who thought the best way to cure a king was to make him throw up until he forgot his own name. His successor, James II, fared even worse. He suffered from chronic massive nosebleeds that would last for days. A physical defect that would strike at the most inconvenient times, like during military briefings or state dinners. Imagine trying to assert your divine right to rule while your face is essentially a fountain of blood that your servants are frantically trying to catch in silver basins. It was a visual betrayal of his authority that no amount of lace could truly cover. The royal carriage was often held together by 17th century equivalent of scaffolding. Underneath those heavy jewel-encrusted crowns were bodies made of whalebone and iron. The Tudors and the Stuarts were essentially living inside human-shaped cages. If a royal child was born with a slight curvature or a weakness in the limbs, the solution wasn't physical therapy. It was a trip to the blacksmith. We're talking about children being strapped into iron corsets and heavy leather braces from the moment they could crawl. It was an attempt to mold them into the rigid, upright symbols of power the public expected. Imagine trying to run a country while your ribcage is being held in a permanent bear hug by an iron plate. It certainly explains why so many of them were so incredibly short-tempered. Then there is the mystery of the silent prince. Every family has a relative they don't talk about at dinner, but the Windsors took that concept to a clinical level. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V, was a bright, lively boy who happened to have epilepsy. In the early 20th century, the royal brand was all about the imperial family, a solid, unbreakable unit of health and tradition. A child having seizures didn't fit that brochure. So they did the unthinkable. They deleted him. John was sent to Wood's farm on the Sangraham estate, a royal shadow tucked behind a garden wall, hidden from the cameras and the public eye. He lived a ghost life for years. When he passed away at just 13, the official response was a brief, cold mention in the papers. It was as if he were a typo in the royal lineage that had finally been erased. He wasn't a tragedy to them. He was a visual inconsistency that threatened the brand. But let's talk about the Hanoverians, specifically George III. History calls him mad, but the forensic soot points to a condition called porphyria. It didn't just mess with his mind, it turned his body into a horror show. His skin would blister at the slightest touch of the sun. His urine turned the color of port wine, and his joints felt like they were being crushed in a vice. The king wasn't just losing his mind, he was losing his physical self. His doctors, in their infinite 18th century wisdom, treated this by blistering his skin with a caustic chemical to draw out the humors. To the public, he was the king of the greatest empire on earth. In the palace, he was a man screaming in a darkened room covered in chemical burns. Even the perfect royals couldn't escape the genetic lottery they were playing with. Queen Victoria is often portrayed as the sturdy, mourning widow of an empire, but she was actually a biological ticking time bomb. Thanks to a spontaneous mutation of her DNA, she became the grandmother of hemophilia. In the world of the atmospheric abyss, hemophilia is the ultimate dark joke. It's a condition where your blood refuses to do its one job, stay inside the body. For the royals who lived in palaces full of sharp corners and heavy furniture, a simple trip over a rug wasn't just embarrassing. It was a potential state funeral. Victoria was healthy, but she passed this thin blood to her children, who then married into every royal house in Europe like a fleet of beautiful, fragile ships. The irony is palpable. These families were so obsessed with keeping their bloodlines pure that they ended up making them liquid. They were so afraid of a common blood that they accidentally ensured their own blood couldn't even form a scab. By the time the 19th century was closing out, the royal families in England, Russia, and Spain were essentially a collection of walking glass figures terrified of a paper cut. This crisis turned the simple act of existing into an extreme sport. Victoria's son, Prince Leopold, lived his life in a state of high-stakes dread. He was brilliant and cultured, but his body was a forensic disaster. Every bruise was an internal crisis, and every joint pain was a week in a darkened room. He was essentially a captive of his own pedigree. He eventually slipped on a floor at a villa in France, a mundane accident that would have left anyone else with a sore hip. But for a man with the royal malady, it was the end of the script. The British Empire was at its peak, ruling over a quarter of the globe, while the people sitting on the velvet chairs were wondering if a sneeze might cause them a brain hemorrhage. They were the most powerful people on Earth, and yet they were being taken down by their own platelets. We've seen the makeup, the iron corsets, the liquid blood. We've seen how they used tailors and hidden farmhouses to keep the reality at bay. But there is one more case file in the back of the drawer, the darkest piece of the puzzle. It involves a king so physically altered by his own lifestyle that he required a secret corridor and a blindfolded surgeon just to maintain the illusion of being human. But before we reveal the giant of the Regency and his secret surgery, we need to make sure you're properly cataloged. To ensure you don't miss any of our stories already stored in the vault, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's the only way to keep the lights on in the cellar. Now, back to the dark. By the time George IV took the throne, he was a structural nightmare. In his youth, he was a slim, handsome prince. But decades of legacy excess turned him into a man who couldn't even stand up without a literal engineering team. He developed a disfigurement of such scale that he was nicknamed the Prince of Wales. Not the Wales we know today, actual Wales. He wore corsets so tightly they supposedly made his face turn a delicate shade of plum, and he had to be hoisted into his trousers by a team of valets. He had developed massive weeping ulcers on his legs that hid under layers of silken padding. He was so self-conscious about this physical state that he eventually stopped appearing in public altogether. He even had a special invisible corridor built so he could move between rooms without being seen by the staff. When you're the King of England and you're afraid of the guy who polishes the silver seeing your ankles, you know the illusion is failing. But the most visceral secret was the Victorian surgery culture. When a royal required a procedure to fix a disfigurement, perhaps a growth or a corrective surgery, it was never done in a hospital. Those were for the soot-covered masses. Instead, the administrative errors were corrected in secret, often in the dead of night within the palace walls. Take the case of Queen Caroline, whose internal health was a closely guarded secret of state. When she fell ill, her bedroom became a fortress. Doctors were sworn to an oath of silence that was arguably more important than their medical oath. One famous account details a surgeon being led through the palace blindfolded, only allowed to see a tiny patch of skin through a hole in a velvet sheet. They weren't treating a patient, they were repairing a national monument, and heaven help the man who left a scar on the property. Even Queen Victoria's own husband, Prince Albert, was subject to the medical secret. He was dying of what was likely stomach cancer or Crohn's disease, a slow physical wasting that made the vigorous leader of the Great Exhibition look like a shadow. Yet the bulletins released to the public spoke of fever and exhaustion. They couldn't admit the prince was rotting from the inside. It would have made the monarchy look mortal. The British monarchy survived because it learned the art of the beautiful lie. They understood that the public doesn't want to see the scoliosis, the lead-eaten skin, or the blood that won't clot. They want ermine. They want to believe that the people in the carriages are made of something sturdier than the rest of us, even when the truth is that they were often held together by little more than starch, secret bandages, and sheer willpower. We look back at these figures and see the winners of history. But when you look through the lens of the vault, you see the price of that victory. You see the human cost of being a symbol. It's a catalog of broken bones, poisoned skin, and hidden rooms. But if you think the British royals had a rough go of it in the genetic lottery, they were practically Olympian athletes compared to their cousins across the pond. While the Windsors and the Tudors were busy hiding their bruises in their braces, another dynasty was taking the concept of keeping it in the family to a level that was physically impossible to hide. If the British royals were the masterclass in PR and clever tailoring, our next subject was the masterclass in biological collapse. To see what happens when the divine right of kings meets a very shallow gene pool, you need to look at the family that traded their health for a jawline that could crush walnuts. To see how a different bloodline took those hidden defects and turned them into a very public downfall, watch our next entry, The Bewitched King, the tragic end of the world's most inbred bloodline. This is Truthish, where things are mostly true and always strange. Thanks for watching.